I just also want to sort of share with you that when I do this with students, the first thing I do in my classes is I share that that a few years ago, I realized that I was only teaching from one perspective, and that was the liberal to radical perspective, the sort of leftist perspective. And that I was in an oral exam, and someone asked one of the students a question about a fairly conservative book in education, but very, very famous person, E.D. Hirsch, and the student couldn't answer it. And that the other things had happened to me, and that I had realized that if they were getting the highest degree in the land, which was the PhD, that they should be educated in the full range of options. And that was my goal as a teacher. So that's one place I stand. Secondly, the Lord is very good to me. He often puts in theology majors in my class. Usually from the School of Theology, because they have to do a couple of courses outside. And so I have them in there, and I often use them as an example. So I'd say, well, now, like, in your field, and then I act like our theology school's teaching Christianity. Oh, well, maybe we can exercise that from the tape. But the most important thing, I think, is that when we do present things, we present them as a matter of fact. This is the way this particular worldview, this particular orientation would see this. And so you just have to we have to kind of be bold. The first few times I tried this, I was pretty nervous, like everybody mentioned before. And there's a lot of little key words you can use, which we heard some today. You can walk into class and say, I was just reading this article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, or somewhere else, and I thought I might share it with you and hear your thoughts about it. So if there's something related that you can find there. Or in medieval Europe, that would give you a big opening for Christianity. Before the Enlightenment, during the Enlightenment, or for science, Francis Bacon, who invented the scientific method, believed that the method would reveal the mind of God. Why do you think? Why do you think he said that? The only place, does anybody know the only place that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2? And that's in the Hebrew Scriptures, where it says 1 can root 1,000 and 2 can root 10,000. That doesn't exactly add up to to 2,000, but anyway. Or what I'm going to do today is going to just be a very little demo, and I don't want to go over time, but I'd even like to kind of end this early, so if anybody had a question or comment, they could ask. Okay, so this is going to be I teach a class on the progression of educational pedagogies, but I also teach a class on the philosophic progression of education in the West. And it's pretty much a philosophy course where we actually read real philosophers. I decided early on that we wouldn't read books about philosophers, but we'd actually read them. So I would be talking to them maybe about the philosophic progression of the West and in the relationship to education and justice. Okay, this would be like a summary, maybe just a little summary thing to get a discussion going. So I would say I would have the classical Greeks here because we would have read them. We would have read Judeo-Christian work. We would have read Augustine and Aquinas. We would have read the liberal humanist. And we would have read the Marxist or the critical theorist. In our field, it's called critical theory more often than not. And I would put this up, and I would usually put the dates. And then I would say that, for example, that this particular area comes out of the dialogues and the Lyceum and the Athenaeum, and it's a classical education which started with the Quadrivium. We would have probably gone through all this a little bit. This particular worldview comes directly out of the Hebrew and the Greek scriptures. And this particular worldview comes out of modernism and the Enlightenment, or the post-Enlightenment. And that this worldview would come out of post-colonialism and to some sort of a post-Marxism, even into postmodernism. And then I would talk about what the goal of each of these were in relationship to justice. That for the classical Greeks, it was a well-ordered city-state, a well-ordered society. That was the purpose of education then, and education in terms of justice. You wanted a well-ordered city-state, and there were within that well-ordered divisions among people that were going to receive education. Here, you would want equity. Now, interestingly, equality as a word only appears once in the Bible. I would actually tell the students this. Equality only appears once, and it's in the scripture about Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Okay, but every place else in the Bible, when it talks about issues like justice, like we might use over here in liberal humanism, the purpose is equality. But here it would be equity, because we all know that some people need more or different things than other people. So in education, you would think about it in terms of equity, not equality. And in critical theory, your ultimate purpose is a revolution in the system. So you're overturning the system. Okay, and what's the root to this? For the classical Greeks, the root was the philosopher. The ultimate thing you wanted to person you wanted to educate is the philosopher kings. There was also an education which was largely a trades education for other people through an apprentice system, and then there were unskilled workers. So the society was fairly well ordered. Here you have kind of an interesting sequence or root, and this comes from straight out of 1 Peter. Peter has the developmental sequence for education, actually, and it goes like this. And just think of our education. I wouldn't say this to the students, but I'm saying it to us. Think of our education in terms of the sequence. Peter says, add to your faith, that's the first one, virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, to perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly love, and to brotherly love love. So that's the sequence actually in 1 Peter. And I would put that up here for this. But this is a very different sequence because the university, I wouldn't say this to the students, but the university begins with the third one, knowledge. And it pretty much ends there now. So that's 2 Peter 1. In liberal humanism, the root is to build steps to level the playing field. So the purpose of education would be to level the playing field. So you have things like Head Start programs, you have free lunch programs, you have early entry programs, you have special remedial programs, special reading programs. You have all kinds of programs because you're trying to reach equality, so you've got to level the playing field. And to the critical theorist, you're doing all sorts of things. You're first of all challenging authority, because authority in this area is seen as power, which is used wrongly to socially reproduce the classes. So the theory here is that schools have been intentionally, and universities have been intentionally invented in such a way that a person who enters them who's poor will actually come out educated only to be poor. And there's some evidence for this. So they're always challenging the authority, and because they are akin to postmodernists, they are always trying to make in their root the familiar seem strange and the strange seem familiar. So they're always trying to bring these two things up, and they're always analyzing things in terms of a kind of post-Marxist social reproduction. So the emphasis here is on economics. But some of the critical theorists also do the same analysis for people like, for things like media. Okay, and what's the result that they all want in terms of justice? So the result over here in critical theory, we'll start over here, is a completely, totally new order. You break down the old order and you create a new order. This is why all Marxist, post-Marxist based theories end in revolution. That is actually the goal of the education. The goal of the education in liberal humanism is generally that education will change society. This was John Dewey's idea. Before John Dewey, no one really thought about education for the actually expressed purpose of changing society. So the reason he had such an open curriculum was that younger people could come in, and then as they came in, they would learn how to learn and how to know things and how to develop things. And therefore, when they got in power, they would be able to change society accordingly. Here the goal is justice and righteousness. This for us, I'm not being a teacher. Now I'm stepping out of that role. Biblically, justice and righteousness are always related. In fact, in the Greek scriptures, they're the same word. So sometimes your New Testament will say, like in James, the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Some versions says the anger of man will not produce the justice of God. So even in Jewish thought, righteousness and justice. So you wouldn't be able, in this worldview, it would not be believed that you would be able to be just if you were not righteous. So an unrighteous nation would not be just. An unjust nation would be unrighteous. So over here, the end result is really still a well-ordered civil society where the citizens, where the society is built in such a way that the citizens are encouraged to be virtuous. Okay. So that the whole structure of the society is supposed to shape you into being a virtuous citizen. Okay, and then I would stop. So I just would have a little overview. But I would do it very matter-of-factly. Because I think that one of the things that in all our fields, one of the better opportunities, which I mentioned earlier today, is to cover the history. Most people, I think this is definitely true even of my own education. It was so narrow that I had no idea where we were in the span of education for all times. I mean, it was just whatever was happening now, sort of what's happening now kind of thing. And I think that most of our fields and our textbooks that we use encourage this, but this would be a way that we could not do that. Now, do we take questions, or did I use up every minute?
No,
I have 5 minutes. Wow. Questions or comments? I would love to hear. And Art has a mic. I forgot that. And Jonathan has a mic. Okay.
We're equipped.
They're equipped. Okay.
Oh, I thought
I'm just going to pass it around.
Oh, you're going to help. Okay, I thought you were going to say something. Nobody has a question. They respond really well. Interestingly, I had my last 5-year review, and I think I had 273 evaluations, and 3 were negative because I brought in my faith, and they spent quite a while talking about that. But the truth is, most students, I believe, and a lot of my students are here, so they could probably answer the truth to you, actually appreciate it. I've had students who are not Christian at all, not even spiritual at all, say out loud in class, "I can't believe we can talk about God in this class. It's so fun." It's like I think they feel it opens the class up so that they can say anything they want. And And I'm very careful. I had an atheist taking classes with Michael Shermer, who's on the Expelled video, who's teaching at our place. And he was after me all the time. And the Lord just really gave me, first he gave me, I prayed for this, a heart of compassion for this guy, this kid. And once I had God's heart for him, a little bit, as much as I could, I could handle that. Because I even let him present a session in the class, a segment of the class on the Dawkins delusion to the class. And the whole evolution argument. So I try to be as open as possible because my belief is that the truth wins. That's certainly what happened in my life. Finally you kick against the truth for so long and then it wins. He wins. Oh. I can't tell if you all are pointing or raising your hand. Okay.
When you were sharing about the three worldviews that we were facing today with pantheistic monism, naturalism, and secular humanism, have you worked as to which one of these has contributed to the growth of each one of those? Or would that be a proper application using this chart historically?
Well, most of these come out of secular humanism, actually. And that's true in my field. That would be the worldview that would be the powers and principalities that I would fight the most, would be secular humanism in the field of education. I really think even postmodernism and all are really secular humanists gone to its natural end. So, and so I use the word liberal humanism here. That's not as inflammatory, I think. So it doesn't look like them.
In what sense do you help students, or do they enter into the notion that the Judeo-Christian worldview or classic tradition, as you've talked about there, is not completely within that box, but there are obviously elements of critical theory and classical Greek that share value and share worldview? Do they get into that crossover?
Yes. Well, I think we do more in the discussion because I'm kind of assuming from the outset that every one of these worldviews has an interest in justice. So the critical theorists are as interested in justice, maybe more so than other people, than all the other groups. And they do share things. I don't think there's any standing worldview or philosophy or theory that does not have some truth in it. And I'm always trying to kind of exacerbate that in class and point out contradictions in the problems, if I know them. But it's like a constant struggle to figure that out. But that's a really good point. I didn't do that here, for sure.
Mary, do you actually have the students self-classify or, begin any self-application, or is it just inert information?
No, it's pretty much information. I do, at the end of most of the classes, have them write, and one of the things they write to is, which of these they most responded to, or what in all of those they believed. Do a kind of self-analysis, a personal analysis paper. But I don't really make them do that out loud in class. I do have lots of students coming to the office, lots of students who want to go to lunch or dinner or coffee or tea, who then really ask you, serious questions or tell you things. I personally think that maybe women professors get this more even than men professors. That a student who's really got a personal problem will approach me maybe before they would a Christian male colleague. I've had students who are not Christian at all ask me to pray for them. I'm not as bold, I should be, as Ken Elzinga, who always asks everybody before they leave his office if he can pray for them, and he's never had anybody turn him down. But I have seen students come to the Lord from various places, including Judaism, and I had a wonderful email. I'm going to see this guy next Friday night, a week from yesterday. I had an email from a guy who was a fellow Marxist when he was in Southern California. We were both Marxist educators, critical theorists, and he was in Indiana, and he emailed me and he said, I was looking on a website and I saw your testimony. And he said, I can't believe it. He said, I couldn't believe it. He said, I have to tell you I'm a completed Jew. And he said, but I've never said anything. I've never done anything in the academic world. And I feel like it's time. And this guy's the dean of education at a big state university. So I'm going to see him on Friday. And that like made me cry when I read the email. It was just so good. Because he was talking about his life and how his family had turned against him. And, they were kind of reconciled some now. And his wife left him, but now he has a new wife and 2 lovely children, and they're going to both be out here, so it'll be really fun to see him. So God is converting all kinds of radical people.
Mary, I wonder if you would be willing to push. I can imagine doing this presentation and then pushing it all one step further by saying, now, look, there are people who are alive today who would advocate for all 4 of those. Mm-hmm. Why would they do that? And then to make a presentation. Why would somebody think that today the classical Greeks had it right and advocate for that position? Mm-hmm. Why would there be people who think that the Judeo-Christian tradition is right and would advocate for that? Why would liberal humanists? Why would critical theorists? What is it that would make that a compelling position for somebody today? And then present as best you can what would make each of those compelling, what would be emphasized so that a person would it's not just 4 options, but this is why people seriously advocate for these positions today. Right. Would you consider doing something like that?
Yes, I would. That's a great idea. Absolutely. I think the students could come up with that too. I mean, I think we have no idea how many Christian students there are. It's just amazing. It always amazes me. When I was dean, I remember going down the list one day and figuring that probably 1/3 of our graduate students were Christian. Several of them are in this room. So I think we have no idea how much they're waiting. When I was first a Christian and I would try to integrate, my first integration was to use a scripture, but not to say it was a scripture. And you would see all these heads go. So you knew immediately who the Christians were because they recognized. It's like everybody else is just taking notes. They're going knocked out of their chair.
Yes, you mentioned discussing justice in this fashion. Which other topics could you discuss with us?
I have a big emphasis on justice, but I also because it's just a philosophic progression. We're spending a lot of time in Judeo-Christianity because unless you skip 1,500 years of philosophers, which most textbooks do, you would have to read Judeo-Christian things. So I bring it up in these kinds of classes, even in my research. See, I didn't know this would happen. I wasn't even really looking for it. But I had found 31 high-performing teachers in low-performing schools. These are like South Central LA, Watts, those East LA. And I found these 31 high-performing teachers, and I was just doing these interviews with them. And every once in a while, I had 4 teachers who spontaneously answered a question which had nothing to do with religion. Like I would say, what do you do with students who are really struggling academically? And this one woman said, well, the first thing I do is pray. Well, okay. You just don't expect that. And then people would say, there was another woman 2 other women who freely talked about the Lord in the interview. So I thought, well, you know what, I better check this out. So at the end, we just gave this little survey to kind of wrap up things we had heard in the interview or not heard in the interview. And I asked them, and what I found is over half of them were Christian, equally divided between Protestants and Catholics. And they all, every one of those people rated on the question, how important is this to your choice of your work in these schools? And every one of those people rated it the highest you could rate it. And then there were another quarter of the people who called themselves spiritual and not religious. One of whom said that the book that most impacted her in the last year was Joel Osteen. I thought, well, okay. People are confused. I understand that. I'm still confused sometimes.
Mary, how do you deal with the problem that only the most recent theory is considered interesting? In other words, how do you even get the classical theory into the discussion and the Judeo-Christian? In all the fields that I deal with, it's always the last stuff that was written is clearly dealt with everything before it,
right,
and everything before it is a waste of time.
Right. I think the students are completely shocked that they like it. You know, I have them still read, this is not an old book, but it's about an old way of thinking, Bloom's book on the closing of the American mind, I guess is the Adler-Bloom group. And they're always surprised. Even these people who come in as very sort of radical, I think they're surprised that there are things in there that they agree about. One of the teachers that I interviewed, the teachers never talked about multiculturalism. This was interesting because they were only teaching Latino and African American kids. There were only 2% white students in their classes, all total. Some of them didn't have any. And when I said multicultural, one guy said, you know, I could teach them all. If I had all black kids and I taught them only black literature, I don't think I'd be doing them any favor. Because while it might help their self-esteem, and I do some of that, really the workout that O. Henry gives your mind is worth it. And he was talking about how they wouldn't be prepared. So, and even with this study, I find that you can raise questions. I think when when you're looking for things, you can raise questions that you wouldn't raise otherwise in other places. But I find they really like to read the classical things. People love Augustine's Confessions, believe it or not, because we have a big discussion about whether or not he has that discussion. We read just certain chapters of it, but he has that big discussion of when he stole the pears, and then in that same chapter, the discussion of how little children are not innocent. And they really they like that kind of thing. I think they're kind of intellectually starved myself. Because the new things are not very deep. I mean, they might be complicated linguistically, but they're not very deep. Oh, hi, Nick.
Mary's probably looking at me funny because I'm one of her students that I guess I never got a chance to ask this question.
He's a professor. He's a professor now.
Once you get out of the hard sciences, for the hard sciences, Christianity is a threat because it challenges mechanistic worldview. But once you get out of that corner, it's not so small as a corner, but that field, then Christianity is mainly the enemy because it's the enemy of pluralism, or it's perceived that way. And how do we handle that? How can we promote healthy thinking about Christianity and help people lower their filters, their affective filters, educationalese we use, about Christianity as an enemy of pluralism? Because if there's something official written into the American mindset at this point in history, especially with what's going on politically at a national level, it's the idea of pluralism. Pluralism is who we are as a nation. So Christianity becomes really an enemy of what we are as a nation, because Christianity is the one that says every point of view is not equally valid. Our point of view is more valid. So.
Right. I don't know if I'm going to answer your question directly, but here, I do in my Christian class, and I can't remember if you took it, but we do specifically cover what are the Christian principles that have to do with diversity. I mean, God made diversity. He likes it. But not all diversity's great. I mean, some of the cells in our body have cancer. Those are not something you really want to celebrate. So you don't celebrate all diversity in Christianity. But here's what I believe has happened. I agree with all the things that you said. I believe that white liberal, secular liberal humanists have co-opted the diversity things. They're actually using black people, Latino people, and poor people as excuses for them to have an exotic lifestyle. So if people in Africa do weird things, strange, bizarre things, then surely I can do this. So, it's a kind of sick use of it. And I've had several instances of this, one of which was involved in a situation I was in being fired as dean. But I had an associate dean who was Native American and Mexican American, but he was conservative, and they hated him. The people who really get attacked are the people of color who are conservative, is what I find. And because they're the threat, you know. And to tell you the truth, before I was a Christian, and the guy who led me to Christ was in my class, he took my radical feminism class, the only man to ever take it. I'm glad to report he's still there, still alive. And I'm sure he took it to kind of get into my mindset, because he prayed for me for 8 years. But it was very disconcerting to me as a liberal leftist educator who was doing this diversity thing. It was very disconcerting to me that he wouldn't join us in that argument. He wouldn't join us in the oppressed argument, or he just wouldn't. It was clear it wasn't him. And he was just so calm about it. That was also irritating. But there's something very sick about this whole way that all this has been, fed on the backs of other people who are really much more conservative than we are. We had that conversation at lunch.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. I'm really interested in your research, and I was intrigued by what you said about accountability and justice. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you've learned in your research about that might be surprising to Christians or that we could learn from.
Okay. Well, the first thing we learned when we went into these teachers' classrooms is how strict they are. It really shocked me. We have an overrepresentation of teachers of color, but we have white teachers, but there's twice as many African American teachers in this sample as you would predict from the proportion of African American teachers in Los Angeles Unified School District. And I think it's because these teachers, and here's a Christian principle, they know how to establish authority, and they do it immediately. I mean, immediately they establish that they're the authority in the room, and the kids begin to feel safe. And because they understand authority, they don't spend any time fighting their authorities. So in Los Angeles, there was a big thing because everybody had to use the same reading series with all their kids, and they had to be on the same page at the same time and things like that. These teachers never, ever mentioned that as a problem to them because they understand that there's this authority structure, I think. So they don't fight testing and things like that. But they're very, very strict with the kids. And they're also loving, but it's in a different way. It's more like a strict parent. And the other thing that I think is particularly Christian is they keep these children's minds focused on their life ahead of them. Not the test, not passing this grade, but their life ahead of them. So I would never go into a classroom. I don't think I was ever in a classroom for a full period where a teacher didn't say, now, I know this might not be what you might not know why you're learning this, but you need to learn this because I don't want you to get ripped off in life. You know, and if you don't understand how to figure this mathematics, you're going to go buy a car, and then they would show it. But it was always like, when you grow up, you're going to want to have a family, you're going to want to have a good job, you're going to want to go to college maybe. But they didn't always say you had to go to college. You know, there were other technical schools they talked to kids about. So they were constantly keeping the children's minds focused on life. And when we asked the children to describe why they thought their teacher was very successful in helping them learn, they said exactly the same thing. Because she doesn't want us to get ripped off. She wants us to have a really good life. She wants us to go to college. She wants us to be at the top of our class, or he. So the kids kind of verified that. And they talked about the teachers being strict. You know, she's strict because she cares about us. Some people might say she's mean, but she's really strict. There's a difference. That was pretty interesting that kids could tell the difference between that. You know, she's strict for a good reason, one kid said. And so you saw it.
When you write up this study, is it going to be for a mainstream audience, or how do you plan to include the findings that you found out about the Christian teachers?
I am going to write it for a mainstream audience. I have written the study as a report to the foundation that funded it, and I'd be happy to send it to anybody who wants it. But I will report that because I used grounded theory, and in grounded theory, it's an emergent design, as you obviously know because you're shaking your head. It's an emergent design, so if you find something that you weren't expecting, you're supposed to alter your design to go figure out whether or not you really found that. And the same if you didn't find something, like multiculturalism, we didn't see that, so we went after that also. So there were a lot of things we went after. And the other thing we asked them is to rank themselves on a conservative to liberal scale, and they're very much moderates. I mean, like the bell curve goes like this. So, yeah, I will report it all. Do you want me to stop? One more? Okay.
I want to ask you a personal question. Having shared your experience with us, would you say, if you were born today again, would you want to experience that time lapse so that when you meet Christ, it makes all the difference?
Wow, what a question. I've thought about that. I think there are advantages and disadvantages to coming to Christ late. First of all, you've got to live that long. That was not easy. In my case, it was definitely God, the power of God, for reason I can still stand here. The advantage is that you understand the mind of the other people, and you understand what their struggles are. You understand how they're lying to themselves. Which is a really important thing to know. I mean, you understand it from the inside, not from a book. The disadvantage is, besides always feeling like I need to catch up, and I mentioned this sort of briefly in the last talk, I really have needed I've needed deliverance from things. I've struggled for years with things. God is always faithful to take them away. But because of just my sexual life, for 3 years, I could stop immediately. Okay, I could stop what I was doing. But the things that were in my mind, now I'm getting really personal and we've got it all on tape. We'll be very careful here. The things that were in my mind did not stop immediately. So, you drive down the road and what are you thinking about? Or you're in a meeting, what are you thinking about? And so I would just continue to confess it and confess that scripture in 1 John 1:9. That's a very important scripture to me. And eventually you wake up one morning and you realize you haven't been doing that. Because God gradually takes things away. I was in a relationship where, and I'll give you a good example, and then we do have to stop because Molly's getting ready to jump up out of her chair. I was in a relationship and we watched a lot of pornography. I actually got into pornography through these so-called art films at the University of Texas in graduate school. So So that was one of the things I struggled with. And you would just be driving down the road thinking of something else, and then all of a sudden the flashing pictures or something. Well, I got on an airplane one day. I was going to Argentina, but somehow they routed me through New York. And anyway, I was in LAX, and I got there early because I'd ridden one of those vans that make you get there 4 hours early, so they're not accused of being late. And I looked up and I saw that there was a plane going before my plane. It hadn't gone yet. And I thought, I'm going to get on that because I got a tight connection in New York. So I asked the guy, and he said, oh, sure, we have plenty of room. So he gives me a seat. And it's one of these huge planes with the 5 seats and the 2 and 2. And I'm in a seat near the sort of kitchen area on a window seat in one of the 2 seats. And suddenly a guy comes on, big guy, with braids, long braids. He has one of those T-shirts on. And sort of those stud things that people wear, everywhere I could see. So he's just like covered with these. And he's got 2 cell phones. This was 1999. That wasn't common for people to have 2 cell phones. And they were both ringing, and he was like talking, you know. And he's seated next to me. Okay, I'm reading my little book about Jesus, right? And on the plane, I turn around to make my escape. I'm looking at all these empty seats. There's tons of empty seats on this airplane. But I'm sitting next to this guy. And I think, I'm going to make an escape. And immediately in my spirit, I felt Jesus said I would sit with him. I thought, yeah, you would. You always sit with those You always sit with those sitters. Like me, you have to say at the end. And then finally they told him to turn off the phone. And I said, so you know what great statements you make to people on the airplane. So you're going to New York. Well, so I said, no. He said, yeah, I'm going to be on the Ricky Lake show. Okay, I don't watch TV, but that didn't sound good to me. I don't know, it just didn't sound good. I said, you are? And he said, yeah. He said, this woman says this kid is mine, but I'm sure it's not. So now I know it's not. This is not going to be a good story. So he tells me, he's all huffing about this. You know, she had all these other men, but they've tested the baby, and so I'm going to find out tomorrow on the show. Okay. So I said that he asked me a question, and then I said to him, so what do you do? And he said to me, I don't think you want to know. And I immediately knew I didn't want to know. And then he said to me, I make adult films. And I said, you know, before I came to Christ, I was addicted to those things. They're really hard to get away from. And he said, yeah. And he said, you know, the longer you're there, the worse they have to be to satisfy you. And he said, you know, I've really got this little girl already. He already had a kid. He had been married, but now divorced. I've got this little girl, and I've always wanted a son, and this is a little boy. So if it, you know, but if I could, I'd get out of this thing. But you can't get out of it once you're in it. And I said to him, you know what? If you get down on your knees and you tell Jesus that you want out, you'll be out so fast you won't know what happened to you. And the Lord had kind of impressed on me to put this little booklet. It's a different 4 spiritual laws. It's one made by Native Americans. It's really beautiful. Very different. Very much a story. And I had it in my purse, and I said, here, if you ever want to do this, here it is. And he gets up and goes to the bathroom. He comes back, pulls down his bag, and starts showing me pictures of his children, of his child, and his wife's family, and his wife, ex-wife. And I said, gosh, you have kind of a soft heart. And he said, how do you know? Oh, I just guessed. And then he went to sleep. And while he was sleeping, right before they served dinner, I felt the Lord was saying to me, pray for him. And I said to the Lord, being the practical person I am, well, what do I do? Like, do I hold his hand? I mean, that's what, I'm just being honest. Okay, so we have dinner, we talk a little bit, and they take up the trays. And when they took up the trays, I said to him, can I pray for you? And that guy grabbed both my hands and pulled them to his chest like this. And he said, please. And honestly, I don't remember what I prayed. It was totally the Holy Spirit. I wasn't even thinking. So then he went back to sleep, and we finally landed, and I said goodbye, went off to my plane. And a few minutes later, that guy comes running down the hall to get me. And he said, ma'am, I'll never forget this plane ride. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. So when I landed in Argentina was the exact time he was supposed to be on the Ricky Lake show. So the people who picked me up, we all started praying for him. But when I asked him what his name was, he said Soiree. And he said, no, it's Edsel. So I don't know. Maybe we'll have a book someday. But that's how God uses your evil. He uses it. Once he cleans you up, he can really use it. So I would give, it's hard for me because I love those things. I mean, I love, helping Edsel. If, planting one little seed or watering one little seed that's already planted. Okay, sorry, Molly.
No, that was a blessing. Thank you. Let's thank Mary. Yes. Thank you so much.